To Whom the Wild Belongs by Reno Hunt. Chapter 6. Alan awoke in the morning to the glorious sound of footsteps. Filled with the excitement of rescue, he scrambled to get from his back to his belly, and Army crawled to the edge, sticking his head out. Alan's eyes locked with those of a black bear, as both were startled into a catatonic state, staring into each other's eyes. This was not the fat, round bear he was accustomed to seeing in these mountains. This guy looked like a stiff wind could blow him over. His thin, patchy fur was scratched bloody like a dog with the mange. His bony frame seemed to be without an ounce of fat or muscle. Flies buzzed around his watering eyes. Alan's heart broke for the poor soul who was clinging to life by a thread. Although Alan felt for him, he had his own problems to deal with. He jolted and shouted, "Get out of here, bear!" The bear lurched backwards, falling over its big paws at the end of his bony legs, and galloped a few strides, stopped and looked back. The bear didn't run as far or as fast as Alan would have liked. He jumped from the pile and grabbed a branch, bolting toward the indecisive bear, which was all the convincing old Slim needed to get the hell out of there as he disappeared into the brush. Alan used his bick to build a small fire. He had nothing to cook, and it was not that cold, but he liked the smell of a fire and could think better looking into the flames. It seemed clear that a smart man would retrace his steps and get back on the slope he had originally descended. That meant finding that red tape he hung from the tree. He thought, what were the alternatives? You take off cross-country? Pick the one correct heading, and the nearest town is 100 miles away. On foot, through the mountains, and across rivers. You pick one of the other 359 headings, and the nearest town might as well be on the moon. Damn it, Alan, why didn't you bring more water? Alan said this aloud, peeling his tongue from the roof of his mouth. He walked and looked and carefully tried to recognize every leaf and rock and cone to find his way back to the red tape. It was an arduous trek, but caution was the uniform of the day. He absolutely could not miss that red tape. If he did, he could walk forever, and might as well be blindfolded while doing so. This had to be a minor bump in the road. The clock was ticking, and Alan could not afford to be stumbling around in the woods for weeks while the deadline came and went. It was imperative that he get the footage and go back to New York to sell it before his daughter lost her spot at Princeton. The deadline was a smidge under 4 weeks away and barreling towards him like a truck with no brakes. Tuition and fees, $40,560. Room and board, $14,000. Books and supplies, $1,500. Miscellaneous expenses, $3,000. A degree from Princeton, priceless. Telling your ex-wife you couldn't come up with your half of the money? Unfathomable. The divorce was final 2 years ago, when their daughter was headed off to college. They had enough in savings to cover the degree when they finally, or rather, she finally called it quits. However, lawyer's fees, 2 rents instead of 1, and the previous 2 years of college had slashed his account to the point where it nearly bled out. They had each come up with half of her first 2 years, but with the wedding photographer business in a slump, Alan was tapped. Your big day deserves more. He shook his head thinking the business card should have said, special day. Your special day deserves more. Regardless, it took his last bit of savings to buy the plane ticket and rent the truck. A friend had even loaned him a legitimate camera out of pity, secretly hoping he wouldn't pawn it. Alan had to make a score and knew exactly how to do it. The spirit bear of coastal British Columbia had become very popular of late, with a documentary a year ago that spawned numerous articles in numerous magazines. Nat Geo did not have that footage and would pay handsomely for his style of natural drama starring the big white bear. Besides, there was no way that he would tell his little girl that he couldn't help her. An hour into his walk, well, it was more of a methodical stalking than a walk, Alan caught a glimpse of something red. Rushing forward, he sprinted toward it, with branches slapping his adrenaline-filled cheeks, only to find a bush of berries. It would have at least been a consolation if it had been something to eat, but the berries were smooth and unfamiliar. That was a bad combination. Failing to find the red tape that day, Alan bedded down in a similar manner again that night, and by the time the shadows were growing long on the next afternoon, it was clear that Alan had passed the red tape without seeing it. The ground he had covered was more than a return trip would have taken. On top of a desperate thirst, hunger began to bore into his belly like a stone in his shoe. A similar pile of branches was set up to stave off the nighttime chill once again, and once again, Alan climbed in to rest his exhausted body. The growling of a man's empty stomach can make it difficult to sleep. However, it was his dry tongue that was raw and burning that made sleep, even in this weary state, nearly impossible. After several hours, the world mercifully faded to black. Alan? He opened his eyes and pulled the covers back to see his little sister Leah standing in his doorway, barely as tall as the knob. She had on her dark blue dress spotted with white and yellow flowers and a white unbuttoned sweater with white shoes. "Get up, Alan. We're gonna miss the bus." Alan sat up, letting the warm covers pile into his lap. Instantly, the cold morning air made him recoil back under the covers. "Let me sleep, Leah." "Alan, get up. We're going to miss the bus." Alan pulled the covers tight over his head. "No, Leah, you're not real. Let me sleep." "Alan, wake up!" He awoke with a start. A twig snapped, then a heavy footfall a little closer. Something approached in the charred black of the cloud-covered night. It came right up to Alan's makeshift beaver dam and slowly circled. He wished he were sound asleep and oblivious to the fact that he was being stalked and evaluated. His mind raced with the image of being dragged from his shelter by the foot and mauled. After an hour, the footsteps drew more distant, and silence returned. With nothing to keep him company but the ringing in his ears from straining to take in every possible sound of the predator's return, this was the single longest night of his life.